This is the story of Jake Miller, a man whose life turned upside down during a tumultuous divorce. Discover his tale, filled with turbulent emotions, legal battles, and unexpected twists of fate. Jake navigated his way through challenging trials, and his narrative captivates and inspires. Welcome to a world where every step is a battle and every decision is an opportunity for a fresh start. While in graduate school, getting my master's degree in chemistry, I met Tammy. I fell in love immediately. I think it took her 6 months, just before she got her MA in art history, before she fell in love with me, but it happened. While I don't think that either of us was especially experienced, as far as I was concerned, our sex life was excellent, and she never voiced any complaints. We got married less than a year after she got her MA and got jobs in the same city. Her teaching at a community college. Me teaching part-time at the state university while also working part-time with a science consulting firm. After 3 years of marriage, I quit the university and worked full-time as a consultant. I became an explosives expert, and one of the clients I worked for was the federal government. About the time that our first daughter, Cassie, was born, I was doing most of my work for the government, and it involved quite a bit of travel. I know that it was hard on Tammy, but I did offer to quit and get a full-time teaching job at a local college which had tried to recruit me many times. However, Tammy liked the money that my job brought in and the lifestyle that it afforded us and encouraged me to stick with it. "I can survive. I'm self-sufficient," was her smiling mantra. My travel had not let up too much by the time of the birth of our second daughter, Grace, 2 years after Cassie was born. I again offered to change professions, but again Tammy insisted that I stick with my consulting job since we now had an extra to feed, clothe, and educate. When the girls were 5 and 7, my schedule let up for a time, and with my help with childcare, and once the girls went to school, Tammy decided to go back to work. She got an administrative job at the local university, primarily dealing with the liberal arts college, for reasons that I never really understood but didn't concern me because it made her happy. Tammy developed a keen interest in photography. We have more than a dozen albums chronicling our lives with the kids. Another seemingly odd interest that Tammy developed at the time was in other languages, primarily Italian. There were times when Tammy traveled on her job, especially to Chicago, where she had meetings with benefactors, visiting professors in the Art Institute, and visits with Gina, a friend of hers from college who was an Italian exchange student at the time but was now working in Chicago. When the girls were 8 and 10, terrorist activities around the world made my skill set extremely valuable to the federal government, and I was recruited to work full-time for them for a 2-year period. I talked it over with Tammy for many hours before accepting the assignment, because it would result in much more travel for that 2-year, or perhaps longer, period, and I would be gone sometimes for more than a month at a time. Tammy encouraged me to take it, saying that she and the girls would miss me but would be fine. My assignment with the federal government caused me to be away for 2 Christmases in a row when Grace was 9 and 10 and Cassie 11 and 12, which was heartbreaking. Tammy took the girls with her to visit Gina in Chicago. I talked to them on the phone every day for their weekly visit, and they seemed happy enough. Apparently, several of Gina's relatives were visiting, some of whom the girls had met before and some of whom were kids about our daughters' ages. Finally, just before Thanksgiving, after I had worked on an assignment, providing my expertise to fight terrorists for more than 2 years, I went back to full-time consulting and rarely traveled. Tammy continued to travel occasionally, normally about once a month for 2 or 3 days, mostly to Chicago, and I was happy to assume all parental duties for Grace and Cassie when she was gone, although sometimes they went with her. I guess it is to be expected that girls become closer to their mother than their father. While I had a good relationship with Grace and Cassie, there really never were important things that they confided in me, and they rarely asked my opinion about personal matters, although it seemed that they were always sharing personal information with Tammy. It didn't really bother me much, except for one thing. They never ever were their normal chatty selves about their experiences when they went with their mother to Chicago. While they weren't withdrawn about it, they never volunteered information and oftentimes would laughingly change the subject. Just before 18-year-old Grace went to college out of state, while Cassie was a junior at another out-of-state college, Tammy had a dark period. I caught her crying on several occasions. I asked her what was wrong, and she choked it up to become an empty nester. "What I need," she said, "is to take the girls on a shopping trip to Chicago." The trip was planned hurriedly and apparently required several long phone conversations with Gina in Italian. Since I didn't understand Italian, I just accepted what Tammy told me about the details. I had no reason to doubt her, even though she had never been as weepy as she had been 3 or 4 days before she and the girls went to Chicago. Tammy returned from Chicago after 3 days, more sanguine, although still not completely normal. That was not the surprising thing, however. What was surprising were a few purchases that the three of them came back with from their shopping excursion. When I inquired about it, I was told that some of the items would be shipped later, including some directly to the girls' college addresses. I did notice that my sex life, which was never bad, except of course when I was away for extended periods of time because I never cheated on Tammy, got better once Grace left for school. I attributed this to Tammy and I growing closer as empty nesters, and I greatly enjoyed the increased frequency. Then the defining event of my story happened. One Thursday, I played hooky from work, starting about noon, without telling Tammy, who was at her normal place of employment. I had planned to play 9 holes of golf, but rain dashed that expectation. However, I was planning for our upcoming anniversary. I wanted to give Tammy a surprise party, so I talked with an event planner. About 3 p.m., a delivery man came to the door with a wooden crate with fragile markings on it, bringing it up the front stairs of our house using a dolly. It was addressed to Tammy. I signed for it, and with the help of the delivery man we placed it in the living room in a stable position, with this side up properly positioned. I thought that the delivery of the crate was odd. I couldn't imagine what was in it. I looked at the return address, and it said, Romano Photography Studios, followed by an address in Chicago, which I knew to be in the city center. I called Tammy at work and told her about the arrival of the crate. She got quiet at first, and then said, "Oh, that's work-related. They were supposed to send it to me at the office. I guess they screwed up. Just leave it unopened, and I'll have someone help me bring it to the office tomorrow." That would normally be a rational explanation, except for 3 things. 1. The complete silence on the other end of the phone for several seconds after I first told her about the crate. A long enough time that I almost asked, "Are you still there?" Since Tammy is never at a loss for words. 2. The way that she told me not to open it. It was a command much more than a request, and her voice was clearly stressed when she said it. Having worked in anti-terrorism for several years, I had become, through osmosis, aware of the importance of stress and nuance. 3. Her entire demeanor, not just a command not to open the crate, was uptight. My curiosity was aroused sufficiently that I took a few photos of the crate and entered the return address information into my laptop. A 4th thing, making me uneasy, occurred. As soon as Tammy returned from work, with only a perfunctory greeting, she raced to the crate, looked it over. Obviously she was inspecting it to see if I had tampered with it, and then she was very vague and standoffish when I asked her what was in it. "Not sure exactly," she said. "But I was expecting some artwork from an organization in Chicago that wanted to set up an exhibition at my school." "Want me to help you open it now?" I asked, not just to be a good guy but also to test her reaction. "Oh no," the normally glib Tammy stammered. "We need to look at it at work to make sure there was no damage, in case an insurance claim is needed." The next morning, even before I left for work, 2 maintenance guys from the college she worked at showed up and carefully moved the crate to a school van under Tammy's careful supervision. When I said, "I can't wait to see the showing at the school when you have everything set up," it wasn't because I was really interested in seeing an exhibition. It was to test Tammy's reaction. Without making eye contact, her response was, "I'm not sure that's what it is, but of course I will let you know if we decide on an exhibition." 2 stammers in less than 14 hours on the same subject by the normally fluent Tammy. If that didn't pique my interest, nothing would. The 5th thing that set me on edge and aroused my suspicions was that Tammy never again said anything about the enigmatic crate. In the 2 weeks after the arrival of the mysterious package, I learned most of what was publicly available about Romano Photography Studios. It was the business entity in the US for a world-famous photographer, Piero Romano. Someone I had probably tangentially heard of at one time or another, but, surprisingly, someone who I'm sure that Tammy never mentioned, despite the fact that both his photography and art were part of her hobby and her work at the university. She often talked about artists and photographers. Piero had a very distinctive style. Most of his photos had both true photographic realism in parts and effects in other parts. He was considered a master of the traditional photographic effects of bokeh, panning, rule of thirds, and long exposure, often combining multiple effects in the same photo. He also was the only practitioner of a unique effect named after him, Romano abilità artistica, which I understand loosely translates into Romano's artistry, but then I never really have seen it written in English. No one else has been able to duplicate it, and it's difficult to describe in words. My best try would be to say that it makes some features super realistic while adjacent ones are fuzzy and with a change of color or shade within the same object, but that description doesn't do it justice. While much of the information about Piero was intellectually and artistically interesting, there were two facts that blew me away. The person in charge of administration at his studio was his niece, Gina Romano Bian. I only knew Tammy's friend, who I had only met once, and never in Chicago, by her married name, Gina Bian. And he had died in a car crash on September 1st of the previous year, and his memorial service in Chicago was on September 6th. How coincidental that it was around September 2nd that Tammy got weepy, supposedly about becoming an empty nester, and that Tammy and the girls were on their shopping trip to Chicago September 5th through 8th. While I'm not a rocket scientist, I am smart enough to have a master's in chemistry from one of the top 10 schools in the country, so I was able to figure it out, despite how crushing it was to me. The only logical explanation was that Tammy had been having a torrid love affair with Piero Romano for at least 10 years, and that my daughters knew all about it. Another interesting fact. There would be a Chicago exhibition of Piero's most famous and stimulating works, including those owned by private collectors, and some of which had never been seen in public before. April 16 to 18, 3 weeks away at the time that I found out this information. I was sure that Tammy would have a business trip to Chicago around that time, despite the fact that the 18th was my birthday, and would likely have, as part of the exhibition, the photograph that was in the crate shipped to our house 2 weeks previously. I was never more motivated in my life than coming up with a plan for dealing with my slut wife and traitorous daughters. Because of my initial rage, which I would have to quell in order to pull off what I wanted, I had to arrange a business trip for the night of the day that I found out the incriminating information and 2 nights hence. I profusely apologized to Tammy in the message that I left on her work phone after packing what I needed from our house for a 3-night stay in a local hotel. Promise to make it up to you. Part 1 of my plan was to get all the necessary divorce papers ready to serve and file once I had the proof that I expected. Part 2 was to find a way to get someone to visit and film the Chicago exhibition on the first day it opened, the 16th, which was by invitation only. Part 3 ways to get my ducks in a row to come out of the divorce with as many material goods and as much money as possible. I no longer cared about my relationship with Tammy and was very, very close to having the same feelings about Grace and Cassie. Part 4 was ultimate revenge, including after the divorce was final. Part 1 was no problem. I got a recommendation for a good divorce attorney, Gail Skiff. She advised me of everything that I needed to do, and, despite the fact that she recommended that the grounds be irreconcilable differences, she was willing to go along with long-standing adultery. Gail just needed a modicum of proof before she could file the papers, which I expected to have for her the morning of the 17th, and she could arrange for service on Tammy by a law enforcement agent, other than the county sheriff, and with a private process server to record the events at the last night of the exhibition on the 18th. For Part 2, I gathered as much information as I could about art appraisers having any relation to Chicago. I found a young appraiser named Roberto Milan who was trying to build his business. I actually went to see him in Chicago and talked with him for almost a full day. Roberto was familiar in general with Piero's work, was certain that he could get an invitation to the opening on the 16th, was not averse to filming what I thought would be the photos that would interest me using a small, expensive, easily hidden HD camera that I gave him, and he thought that he could make a good, and high, appraisal of what the photos I expected to be there were worth. Some really experienced appraiser may be able to tear down my analysis, but I would welcome the challenge since it would help establish me as a real player in the art appraisal world. For another segment of Part 3, I cashed in 2 bearer bonds that we had in our safe deposit box for at least 12 years. I didn't remember if Tammy ever really knew about them, and she certainly wouldn't remember them now. They were now worth, together, about $25,000. For another segment of Part 3, I provided my attorney with a complete list of all of our assets, including an appraisal of our house. I took photographs of all of Tammy's jewelry and all the contents of our safe deposit box, minus the bearer bonds, of course, and provided my attorney with updated bank statements, credit card numbers, outstanding purchases, retirement plans, and brokerage accounts. As a small segment of Part 4, the last day that I was supposedly out of town, I snuck into the house while Tammy was at work and, with a magic marker, obliterated my face on every single photograph in a dozen or so albums that Tammy had made over the years. Never having reviewed them in their entirety before, I was surprised at the low percentage of photos that I was in, no more than 15%. I also found 2 photos I had never seen before that, even if I had, I probably would have considered innocent. They had Tammy, Gina, Grace, Cassie, and, drumroll, Piero in them. These photos I made high-quality scans and photocopies of before returning them to the album with black marker across them and an arrow to Piero and a legend, the love of Tammy's life. Tammy had told me, 2 days after I got back from my business trip, that she had to go to Chicago from the morning of the 15th to the afternoon of the 19th. When I expressed disappointment that she wouldn't be with me on my birthday and suggested that I accompany her, she, smoothly, apparently having planned on my reaction to her saying that it was all business, said that she would take me to a resort the following weekend and make it up to you in a way that you've never experienced before. She followed that statement with a kiss, and at that point in time I looked upon her as a $3 horse, so I just enjoyed myself. She gagged a little, and obviously wasn't pleased, but pretended that she was. And that was only a sample of what's to come, darling. For all of parts 1 through 4 there was a particularly risky part of my plan. The rest, especially after getting comfortable with and hiring the art appraiser, I was quite confident would fall into place. The risky part was talking to Grace. I decided that I needed a face-to-face with Grace, so as soon as I dropped Tammy off at the airport the morning of the 15th I drove the 180 or so miles from Columbus to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where Grace was studying chemical engineering. Why Grace and not Cassie? While both girls were much more like their mother than me, Grace was by far more like me, at least as far as how her brain worked, than Cassie. Neither Cassie nor Tammy could ever conceive of a course of studying chemical engineering, of course, very close to my degrees in chemistry. Also, Grace had a harder time lying than either Cassie or Tammy, and, although her failure to advise me of Tammy's love affair with Piero indicated otherwise, or maybe not, was more concerned with the nuclear family than Cassie was. I called ahead to Grace's cell phone when I was about halfway there. She actually seemed excited to meet. I told her I'd take her to a late lunch at a real restaurant, where we met at the area of her choosing about a mile from campus. After we ate, I said, "There's something very serious I need to talk to you about, Gracie." She got a perplexed look on her face. "Are you okay, Dad?" Physically, yes, but emotionally, despite my apparent lack of outward displays, I'm a wreck. Before I talk to you, though, I want you to promise that you won't tell anyone about this, including your mom and Cassie, until the day after my birthday. Promise? I said, promise? While sounding serious, and she gulped. Okay, Dad, I promise. I swear. She said, holding up her hand and trying to force a smile. I found out about your mother's love affair with Piero Romano, and I'm trying to decide whether to divorce her. I blurted out. Oh no, Daddy. She cried, holding her hand over her mouth, tears instantly forming. There's only *1 hope. I need to find out all that you know about it, and I need you to take a DNA test. She cried before going to the brink of a full-out meltdown. I saw that the restaurant was no place for this. I told her, meet me outside, and we'll then go to my car. After I paid the bill, I tracked down the waitress, paid in cash with a $20 tip. I found Grace still in tears on the sidewalk. Once we got into my car, I said, Okay, Grace, spill. Our family's continued existence depends upon it. After a few minutes of sobbing, during which she couldn't get anything out, and with me just staring at her, she started talking. I didn't realize that Mom was sleeping with Piero, or Uncle Pooh, as we were told to call him, until I was 12. Despite displays of affection every time that we were in Chicago, especially at Christmas. I know that, from comments that Cassie made, she knew before then, I wasn't sophisticated enough to figure it out. I confronted Mom. She said that it was an adult thing, that she was in love with two men, and that I'd understand when I grew up, and that you must never know because it might mean the end of our family, because you were too insensitive. I think that's the word that she used, to understand it. Therefore, I was sworn to secrecy. Grace broke down again for a while and then continued. I hoped that at Pooh's funeral, that would be the end of it, and that you would never find out. After she made a fool of herself at his casket, I confronted her again. I told her that if she just jumped into someone else's arms I'd tell you the whole story. She looked at me and asked how I could think of her like that. She had loved Piero and loved you, and there would be no one else, she just had to honor Pooh's memory. I believed her and prayed that this day, when you found out, would never come because I'm sure she won't have another love, or even a sexual affair. I pumped her for additional information until I determined that it would be counterproductive to get more. She was, as I had hoped, still in a state of anguish when I hit her with the second reason for my visit. I'm hoping to make it work with your mother, and what you've told me will help. However, I need one more thing. I need us to submit DNA samples to see if you are my biological daughter. No, Daddy, no, she cried. You're my only father. I know that I'm your father, I replied. But I have to know whether I'm your biological one, too. She protested some more but finally agreed. I showed her the letter in the envelope addressed to the lab, and then I sealed it up. The instructions in the letter were to mail the results to both Grace directly and to me. When I drove her back to campus, she watched as I dropped the envelope into an express mail mailbox on the way. When we hugged goodbye, she begged. Promise that you'll forgive Mom and make it work. I can't promise now, since I don't lie, like she does. However, you have done your part to increase the chances that it will work. Now remember, don't tell anyone about our talk until the 19th at the earliest. I promised. She smiled, then she stuttered. There's one more thing I should tell you. Mom and Cassie will be at a Chicago exhibition of Pooh's works, some of which are photographs of Mom, on your birthday. She told me that she was sorry that it worked out like that, but she has to attend since works that she inherited from Piero, under his will, are going to be displayed. She wanted me to come too, but I had too much work at school. I smiled and, as nonchalantly as I could, replied. I know. Thanks for being honest. We hugged again, and she was off. She didn't see the tears that I shed, knowing that my relationship with Cassie was now as dead as the one with Tammy, but not deciding yet if I could salvage it with Grace. Grace didn't know that I had recorded our conversation in the car. There was one thing that Grace didn't know, that would cause her pain, and was a segment of part 4 of my plan. The swabs that I put into the envelope that were supposedly mine were that of an Italian background janitor who worked in my office building, who I had been friendly with over the years. I promised to pay to have his ancestry determined, as a birthday present, to him. He didn't even ask why I needed 3 swabs instead of 1 to do that. The one I did send in for testing showed that he was more than 80% Italian, with some Eastern and Western European small contributions, which made him happy. Why did I put an Italian's DNA in what was to be tested instead of mine? Because I wanted everyone to hurt. The reason I used an Italian is because during DNA testing they can, even if comparing 2 sets, find out the heritage of both contributors, and, since Piero was Italian, I wanted everyone to conclude that he was the father of Grace, and, if I could work it out, Cassie. I crossed my fingers that Grace wouldn't tell me I'd talked to her on the phone on the 16th and 18th, and she promised that she hadn't, and, since I hadn't heard from Tammy, I was sure that that was true. Around 11 p.m. on the 16th, Roberto Milan emailed photos of the relevant parts of the Romano exhibit to me. They hit me deeper than I thought they would. I shook like a leaf as I sobbed while viewing them. There was a series of 10 photos, increasing in size from the first to the last. They all had distinctive Romano characteristics, including, in the last 2, brilliant, Romano abilità artistica, effects. The series was entitled, Nel Amore, Christmas Love. What initially broke me up were the first 2 in the series, which showed 2 girls in the background of a photo of a woman who was unquestionably Tammy. While there was blurring of the girls' faces, there was no doubt, from their hair, what they were wearing, Christmas gifts from my mother, and relative sizes, that it was Cassie and Grace when they were around 9 and 11. In the second photo of the first two, one of Tammy's breasts was exposed, and she had what could only be described as a "come hither" look. The next three in the series, Tammy was increasingly less dressed, until, in the final one, she was nude. The second series started again with a photo where the girls were in the background, this time somewhat older, with the last four progressively racier, until the second to last, which had Tammy in an exceptional pose, and the last one, where the clear implication was that she had just been made love to, and was in bliss. After I threw up, drank some ginger ale, and had a good cry, I looked at the photos again. If they didn't break my heart out, I'd have to say that the last two photos were probably the best of their type one had ever seen. I read the text accompanying Roberto Milan's report. "Sorry, I know that this will be hard on you. The collection is worth a minimum of $300,000, more likely $500,000. The second-to-last photo alone would bring $125,000 to $175,000 if sold separately. The last two photos are the best execution of Romano Abilita Artistica effects in history, not just in my opinion, but in that of at least four other appraisers and art critics that I overheard talking about them. I asked Gina if any were for sale. She put me in touch with the owner, Piero, not surprisingly, Tammy. Tammy said that they weren't for sale at the present time because they were priceless, and that the four where she was completely nude would not be sold until after her death. I wouldn't want the general public, and especially my husband, seeing me like that while I'm alive. She said, especially my husband, with a laugh. I emailed the digital form of my recording of what Grace said and Roberto's photos and words to my attorney, Gail Skiff. She called me at 7:30 a.m. the morning of the 17th. Obviously, your petition for divorce is justified in alleging adultery. A law enforcement officer will serve Tammy tomorrow night at the gala. There's one thing I need to add. I said, I'll drop it off so that you can express it to your process server with the divorce papers. I dropped an envelope addressed to Cassie off with Gail. In the envelope was a letter from me, a swab of the Italian janitor's cheek, a container with a new swab, and an envelope provided with express mail postage, addressed to a DNA lab with included instructions. The letter from me to Cassie read, Cassie, if there is any hope that you and I have a relationship in the future, there's one thing that you need to do for me. You need to swab the inside of your cheek, insert it into the envelope, addressed to the DNA lab, with my swab already in it, and express mail the envelope. As you will see, the lab has instructions to mail the results directly to you, at school, as well as to me. Maybe you don't want a relationship with me in the future. You still need to do as I ask, however, because, if you don't, I will make sure that our money is tied up for years, and you can kiss goodbye to the tuition, room and board, and expenses for the end of your junior year and your senior year at that expensive private college you attend. So, even if you hate me as much as your actions, and inactions, toward me in the past would indicate, it is in your self-interest to do as I ask. Grace has already complied. Your father, Jake Miller. I was glad that I wasn't there when reality hit the fan in Chicago on my birthday. The process server reported to Gail that Tammy and Cassie were all smiles as they hobnobbed with the public at about 9:00 p.m. on the 18th. They were perplexed when they were handed the envelopes by the law enforcement officer, as the process server with him took photos. They opened up the envelopes on the spot. The law enforcement officer left, but the process server stayed behind, taking more photos until he was kicked out. The photos he emailed to Gail, and Gail to me, showed Tammy sinking lower and lower onto the ground, ultimately landing in a fetal position, and Cassie, first distraught, then angry, and then trying to tend to her prone mother. Cassie called me the morning of the 19th. After expressing her disgust with the way that I handled serving the papers, to which I replied, "Tough, traitorous bitch. Tell it to someone who gives a curse." A type of words I had never used with her before in her life. She said, "I'm not inclined to do the DNA thing. I don't want to find out who your biological father is, instead of the sap who's been supporting you all these years." Sarcastically, I asked, "You are my father?" She replied, "Maybe, maybe not." I responded, One thing is for sure, however. I've already had my attorney freeze all of your mother's and my accounts, and I can assure you that there will be no money for your education, or even living expenses, since you're 20 years old, in the future, unless you mail that envelope with your cheek swab, now. That I think of it, I'll need a video of you swabbing your cheek, putting it in the envelope, and mailing it, all contemporaneously, in order to believe you, in view of the lies that you've told me over the years. I haven't lied to you. Oh, really? You didn't tell the whole truth, though, did you? Your sister has remorse and will get her tuition paid. You are, apparently, as foul a bitch as your mother, so I'm not going to waste time discussing it with you, because you make me sick. Either do as I say and email me the video, or this is the last conversation that we ever have, in your life. With that, I slammed the phone down. It's nice to have a landline, where you can make a statement by slamming the phone down, rather than simply pushing that red button, which provides no emphasis, on a cell phone. The vile mother didn't try to call me from the 18th to the 21st, and probably delayed her return to Columbus for 2 days, commiserating with her bosom buddy, Gina. The excitement at the exhibition on the 18th was reported in 2 local Chicago papers. A photo of Tammy, obviously sold to them by the process server, appeared in each. I got a good chuckle, between my urges to expel my stomach contents. Apparently, the vile bitch did come to the house, no longer a home, as far as I was concerned, on the 22nd. I knew only because the envelope that I had left on the new front door, one made of steel, with the frame reinforced, and the lock changed, was no longer there, and my attorney had left a message on my cell phone that we needed to talk. The envelope was addressed to vile fucking, which I assumed that Tammy would know was her. My inside message was, Turdbish, have your attorney contact mine about when you can pick up your personal stuff. The sooner we sell the house and get our sham of a marriage over with, the better. I will fight every attempt by you to live back in this house until it is sold. Do something decent, for the first time in our farcical relationship. Don't fight it. Your formerly clueless ex. Jake. P.S. The doors are booby-trapped. Any unauthorized entry will start all of your previous family albums on fire. It required a court appearance by the attorneys. For something to be worked out with respect to living arrangements, I probably could have gotten exactly what I wanted if I didn't put that PS on the note to the slut, but I couldn't help myself. We finally, through our attorneys, agreed to both vacate the house and immediately put it on the market, with the amount of our temporary housing expenses considered in the division of assets. Tammy tried to be difficult in the monetary negotiations, but she had no bargaining power, because she acquired her precious photographs from Piero while we were still married. When I demanded 5 photographs, she could choose 1, then me, etc., until all 10 were divvied up. According to her attorney, she got hysterical, especially since, by that time, she had seen how I had doctored the family photo albums. At Tammy's insistence, we took Roberto's appraisal of the photographs, one done by an appraiser hired by her, and one by a neutral appraiser. Hilariously, Roberto's was the lowest one, costing her $200,000 more than if she had accepted his appraisal. Since this was seriously cutting into what she would end up with, she offered me 2 of the photographs that she chose. However, she resented that offer when I had my attorney tell hers that I agreed, as long as she had them delivered to the local firing range and she watched what I did to them. When all was said and done, by the time the divorce proceedings had concluded, Tammy was left with her personal possessions, half the furniture, and 1/4 of the sale price of the house, nothing else, including no alimony, but a suspended jail sentence. We did agree to jointly pay all of the college expenses of Grace and Cassie until they graduated, but nothing more than that. As for Cassie and Grace, as expected, the DNA results came back that they were not my biological daughters. That infuriated Tammy so much that she almost had a stroke. I talked to Grace about it, not Cassie, who had complied with my request solely to get her college expenses paid, and, apparently, was happy with no future relationship with me. Dad, Mom says that the results are wrong. She said. She said that, while she was married to you, she never had sex with anyone besides you and Piero, and that she never even met Piero before I was born. Then why is your father of Italian ancestry like Piero, while I'm Dutch all the way back, on both sides of my family? Your mother has demonstrated that she is a pathological liar, having lied to me about loving me for the entire 24+ years of our relationship. So why would you believe that anything she says is true? She says she wants another DNA test. Not going to happen, because you're not minor children, and it has nothing to do with the divorce. I just wanted to know, in my mind, and have you and Cassie know, the truth. Plus, you saw me swab my cheek and put the swab in the envelope, and then mail it yourself. Dad, Mom also wants to talk with you, person to person. She says that she's made the request to her attorney a number of times, but isn't even sure that your attorney gave you the message, because she never got a response. She didn't get a response because I told my attorneys to ignore her request. What possible reason could I have to talk to that crap? Dad, please don't call her that to me. I still love her, despite her faults. I'm asking you, please, as a favor to me, that you talk with her, for an hour. Sorry, Grace, no can do. I have forgiven you and would like to maintain a relationship with you, but there is nothing, and I mean nothing, that would cause me to talk with her, now. For Tammy's suspended jail sentence and getting only 1/4 of the proceeds of the sale of the house, after my phone conversation with Grace about the DNA test and Tammy's desire for a talk with me, she did something stupid. I thought that she might pull something, so I hooked up and walked around with a panic button, connected directly to a private security company. One night, a woman knocked on the door of the condo that I was renting during the divorce proceedings, until the final financial details were worked out. I didn't see the two big guys and Tammy standing off to the side when I looked through the peephole. As soon as I opened the door, the two big guys burst in and grabbed me, but not before I pushed my silent panic button. Once they grabbed me, they yanked me over to a chair and tied me to it, while Tammy and the other woman took off. Jake, I'm sorry that I had to do this, but you refused to meet with me, and refused to redo the DNA test. Which both you and I know is wrong. She said, starting out with some happy talk about always loving me, and that she just loved Piero, and, in addition, that her heart was big enough for both of us. She realized that we were past the point of reconciliation, but just wanted to get things off her chest. As she was talking to me, she was holding a swab up, obviously going to force a DNA sample from me. It really irritated her that I made no verbal response whatsoever to anything she said. I refused to even acknowledge her presence, trying my best to avoid all eye contact. Fortunately, as she was about to have her two goons pry my mouth open for a DNA swab, there was a response to my panic button. The security company had called the police, and 3 cops, with guns drawn, barged into the house. They found me tied up, and one of the miscreants had illegal things in his pants pocket. I explained the situation. The cops ignored Tammy's pleas to simply let them go. They meant no harm, and they arrested the 3 of them. The little kidnapping event didn't play well with the judge in our divorce proceedings. After she let it be known that, if she had to rule, it would be really bad for Tammy, I got the division of assets and other considerations set forth above. The criminal court took pity on Tammy. Since it was her first offense, she got a 2-year suspended sentence and a $10,000 fine, which was from her share, alone, of the marital assets. The 2 guys didn't fare as well, because they had shady histories. One got a year in prison before parole was possible, and the one with the illegal things got 5 years before parole was possible. Part 4 of my plan did not end when the divorce was final, although I will not admit, here or anywhere else, that I had anything to do with it. Just karma, is what I always respond to when asked about it. 18 months after the divorce was final, I was on a cruise of the Caribbean with a 32-year-old hot little divorcee who loved to be treated right, and richly. She looked too much like Tammy at that age, and was too hot for me to look for a permanent relationship with, but she was fun to be with, even though she wore me out. While I was dating on the cruise, Tammy's apartment was broken into while she was at work. The place was trashed. Some things were stolen, including the second most provocative and valuable Romano photo of Tammy. More things were destroyed than stolen, however, including 7 of the other 8 remaining Romano photos, and all of the family photo albums, of course. I was a suspect when I got back. Obviously, I couldn't have done it myself, since I was on a boat 2,000 miles away, but Tammy insisted to the cops that I paid someone to do it. When the cops approached me, as soon as they started asking questions indicating that I was a suspect, I refused to talk to them, and got a criminal attorney. After searching my phone and financial records, which, of course, did not include the 2 cashed-out bearer bonds that were never part of the divorce estate, they could find no indication that I could have paid anyone to do it, nor was there any association that they could find with anyone who was capable of doing what had been done. I got the distinct impression that, 6 months after their initial contact with me, the cops, for all practical purposes, gave up, even though I'm sure that Tammy kept pestering them. Once the statute of limitations expired, I threw a party, my "It's All Finally Over" party. It was attended, mostly, by friends. My parents were no longer alive, but my brother, his wife, my 2 nephews, my new love interest, Darlene, Darlene's 2 adult children, and Grace, her husband, and my granddaughter, were there. I then had, and now have, no relationship with Cassie. I wasn't invited to her wedding and wouldn't have gone, even if invited. I did hear, from Grace, that Cassie's husband caught her cheating, however, and she is in the early stages of divorce proceedings. Grace was given an ultimatum by Tammy: either cut all ties with me or her. To everyone's surprise, including mine, she chose me, probably because she was convinced that Tammy was, as I had presented, a pathological liar. Even more importantly, Grace realized how horrible it was that her mother threw away her relationship with her paramour, and her daughter's futures, and had them lie to cover up her cheating. Grace didn't want her children exposed to that attitude. Only one thing has caused friction between Grace and me in the last 5 years. I told her the truth about the DNA testing. She was mad at me, at first, but forgave me, just like I forgave her for her duplicity over the years, and was actually very happy that I was her biological father. I had another DNA test done to prove it, in addition to a practical one. This story about Jake captivates with its emotional intensity and unexpected plot twists. Relationships, legal proceedings, and personal trials create a captivating portrayal of the human experience.